No, dober večer. So, welcome, Anna. Vsi razumete angleško ali potrebujete prevode? Ne? Predvsem gledam mlajšo generacijo? Ne? Torej, dobro. Okay, we can continue in English. Yep, well, you never know. So, as we mentioned at the beginning, when I was asking you how should we start, I must say that at the beginning that I was very impressed. This is the first time I can say that your books were translated to Slovenian before they were translated in English. That's something I'm really proud of. Usually it's the other way around. But when you first published your book, you were very young. And 4 publishers were trying to publish your book. So what was that book so special about that they all wanted to publish your book?
No, it was actually the other way around. 4 publishers did not want to publish my book.
Yeah, that's the most reasonable story.
No, I started out writing when I was, quite young. I didn't consider myself to be young, but I was 12, and I thought I should really hurry and start doing something with my life. It started out with me just loving books, and I read a lot. And then someday I was wondering why other people always get to decide what happens in a book. So I wanted to decide for myself. So I made up a story about 5 kids. They're alone in a house for the entire summer holidays, and they don't have any money, so they start their own restaurant. Because I loved cooking, so I wanted to do something with cooking in my story. But after like 2 pages, I just didn't know how to go on. But for years and years, every summer holidays, I would try and write a book. And at first, maybe I had 2 chapters. And next summer, I tried a new book, and I had 5 chapters. And then when I was 17, the first book was properly ready. That was actually the story about the 5 kids starting their own restaurant. That was the story I finished first. And then I sent it to a publisher, and I had to wait for 7 months. And then they sent me this very short and very rude notice that they didn't like it at all. They didn't want to publish it. So I sent it to another publisher and had to wait 5 months. They didn't want it either. But the 4th publisher did want to publish it. So I was 20 when my first book was in bookstores.
So I guess now, after 28 books, the thing is different. Suddenly they want to publish your book. And you don't have to wait 7 months, but they wait you for 7 months to write the story till the end. I hope so.
Yeah, it was actually quite funny at the Leipziger Buchmesse a couple of months ago in Germany. I met one of the publishers who worked for the publishing house who rejected my first book. And
that was a satisfaction.
Yes.
Exactly. What did you say to them, if you can tell us?
Well, it was funny because just like a week ago, when I just started writing, I would save every interview. I would cut out every book review, and I had this scrapbook with the whole start of my career. But the scrapbook begins with the horrible short notice: "No, we don't want your book." And for some reason I had been going through the scrapbook the week before, so I took a picture of it. So I could actually show the notice to the publisher.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So, as I mentioned, 28 books, all mostly for youngsters and young adults and so on.
Yeah.
In Slovenia, many times when we read interviews or we write about children literature for youngsters, we say that this is a more easy literature to write and so on, and every time writers tell us that that's not true. How's in your home country? Is the perception kind of the same? are authors for youngsters and young adults something a bit less important?
Yeah, sadly it's the same, and people still ask me, will you ever write a real book?
And what's your answer to that?
Well, by now I don't care that much, and I'm happily telling them my books are being translated into 28 languages and
Exactly.
movies are made out of them, and I just bought a house in Utrecht because I write books for children. But I think, there is a serious question underneath, a serious problem. I think in our society we don't take children seriously enough. We should be taking children very seriously, because they're human beings, they're actual people just like we, and they think like we, and they have feelings, and we're actually leaving them a chaotic mess. The world right now is just, we adults should be ashamed. And on top of everything else, we don't take kids seriously, and I think it's the same here in Slovenia. I think professions like teacher, people don't take being a teacher really serious. People who work with kids are paid less than people who work with adults. It's just crazy, really. So I wish children's books were taken more seriously, but most of all, I wish children were taken more seriously.
But that's something you prove in all your books. You never underestimate children. You never take care of them throughout the book. You're writing it as it is. So, but all of your books are a bit different. They're all connected with your life. So, this last book that was just published in Slovenian, Predor, is happening in the Second World War. Based on what I was checking on the internet, that was not the time you lived in. So, how did you connect? Why Second World War? Why did you decide to go back in time to write about Second World War? What was this first idea, first inspiration? Why Second World War?
Well, it's a strange story, actually. The first inspiration was a dream. I dreamt about a group of young people taking shelter underground. And they were in the dark, and in the dream I could feel this huge danger. And in my dream I had no idea what was going on. But the young people were having, once again, in my dream, they were having these really intense conversations about life, about who they want to be. And I remember having those conversations from being a teenager, with your whole life before you, and the feeling anything can happen really, and you can become anyone. You just have to decide on it. And I woke up and I was so impressed by these young people taking shelter in the dark with this big danger. I thought, I have to find the sort of background of my dream. So I searched in history and all over the world, what could I write about? And then I arrived in London, 1940, Second World War, and the Blitz. For 8 months, London was bombed every night, and the government hadn't been building enough shelters, so tens of thousands of people were taking shelter underground in the tunnels, on the platforms of the metro stations. And straight away I knew this is where my dream was taking place. This is what I'm supposed to be writing about now. So I went to London, I did a lot of research, I read so many books, because yes, I didn't live back then. Actually my father did. I have a very old father who was born in 1932. So he was a boy in Amsterdam during the Second World War. So my sister and I grew up with dinner time stories of the Second World War. And only later I realized that all my friends, I mean, their grandparents lived through the war. But for me, it was just my dad, so it was a very normal thing to be hearing stories about the Second World War. But well, then I chose London, and I had to do a lot of research. So that's very strange, actually, the whole book starting with a dream.
Well, you mentioned dream before we continue about
Yeah.
the book. Does every process for your book start with a dream?
No, that's why I'm surprised about it myself. Once before in a book, maybe my third book or something, way back, I actually dreamt the ending of the book, and my brain really thankful because I had been agonizing about the ending and I didn't know how to, I needed some sort of solution, and I dreamt it, which was great. I didn't need to think about it anymore, I just dreamt it. But then for ages I didn't dream anything interesting until with the tunnel.
With the tunnel. So it's the Second World War. When I got the book from the publisher, I got scared, I must say. I was like, oh, another Second World War book. But it's way different than that, because Second World War is just something that is happening. I think what you managed to show through all the characters in that book is that life was still happening. So is that something, since you mentioned your father lived in the Second World War, was that something you got from your father, that the life was still happening? Were there stories about it?
Yeah, for example, my dad told many stories about the war, and then one day he told my sister and me that at some point during the war in 1943, right in the middle, his big sister got married. And I remember being so surprised. Somehow his big sister fell in love and got married. There was a wedding during the war, and of course, people did go on living for, well, for some people it wasn't possible, but as far as it was possible, people did go on with their lives. They fell in love, they had babies, they died from old age. So many normal things happened too, and I think especially for kids and teenagers, they are still growing up, even with the war going on. So all the sort of normal teenage things and feelings, like being insecure about the way you look, or falling in love, being attracted to someone, all those things did still happen during the Second World War and during any war, really.
But was that something that you decided, I want to write about Second World War and I want my characters to just live while the war is happening around? Or was that something that happened when you started writing, when you started developing the story, that they suddenly got their lives and the war was just around them, the bombs were falling and so on?
I just wanted them to have the very intense conversations in the dark, because that was what my dream was about. That was what the whole book started with for me. And then I studied history after high school, so I actually love doing historical research. So I was really caught by the whole topic, and I really dived into it and read so many books. And then I did want to use quite a lot of the things I discovered in the books. But it started with these ordinary teenagers trying to grow up.
So now the question that I always like to ask writers who write for youngsters and young adults, how does one write the thoughts of a young person? What's the process behind that? Because when you have to write it, you have to know their language, you have to know how they speak, how they think. How do you keep a child inside yourself? Do you remember when you were young?
I actually used to be a child, and I have been a teenager, and to me there's not this sort of seizure where I stopped being a child and then became a teenager and then became this whole different person, a grown-up. No, I still feel I'm the same person. And I think it did help that I started writing when I was so young. So I'm really, when I was still young, I learned to put my thoughts into words, and I was already very aware of, well, what it felt to live, really.
Of your surroundings.
Yeah, of my surroundings, of everything really, of being alive and 12 years old. So I can still remember very clearly. And of course, teenagers nowadays are a bit different, but many teenage feelings haven't changed. I mean, falling in love, meeting someone new, getting to know each other, fighting with your parents, all those feelings haven't changed that much, I think. I think the thing that really did change is that everyone has a mobile phone in their hands now, and social media and YouTube. But I'm addicted to my phone too, so I can imagine what teenagers feel waiting for likes on their new post. So yeah, I mean, of course, with the tunnel, there's no social media going on in 1940, but most of my books are contemporary. And I add things like social media. And I think I'm still able to do that. Maybe in like 20 or 40 years, I won't be able to understand young people anymore.
So then a different question. Was it hard to go back in time, to not put social media in your books, phones, to the children, to just leave them without knowing that there will be internet, there will be Netflix?
That was actually very nice, because I've heard older writers complain that it's really such a nuisance having these phones in your stories, and people don't get lost anymore, and people can always reach each other. And I tell them, yeah, well, you can just have the battery die, and then they're lost. Don't worry about that.
Use imagination.
I mean, there are always solutions to that. But yeah, I actually very much enjoyed writing a book with no social media, no internet, and just, for example, the two girls, Quinn and Ella, they meet because Quinn asks the way to a hospital where she wants to become a nurse. Nowadays, she would have her phone and use Google Maps and not ask Ella for directions. Not
ask a stranger.
Exactly.
For address.
So it was, in a way, it really helped my story. And then the younger brother gets lost, and there's this huge adventure. They have to go and look for him. If he just had his phone with him, that would have been quite boring for the story.
So, as you mentioned, you wanted to write about children talking in the dark in the tunnel.
Yeah.
And then from that on, you created a whole story about Ella and Quinn, so everyday girl meeting a high society girl in the middle of the war. Everyone are the same, sleeping in the tunnel. And then there comes love and lost brother and so on. It's really a story that you just want to turn pages and find out what's going to happen. But as you mentioned, you studied history and they didn't have phones and so on. What about if you wanted to start writing about children in the tunnel, in the dark, what was the process of the whole backstory of Quinn, Ella? How did they came alive? What was the idea of this high society meeting middle class society or lower class society, the World War? What was your process of thinking?
Well, I think one of the very interesting things about British society, especially back then, was that it was very much a class society and very outspoken about people either belonging to middle class or lower class or upper middle class. They have so many varieties, and I actually think, nowadays we don't, in the Netherlands, we don't really say it like that, but it's still the case, and especially with money. It's really crazy to me, these differences in how rich some people are and how poor some people are. And somehow we're sort of okay with that because we don't really change it. And to me it's not okay, but we don't really change it anyway. So for me it was very interesting to be able to write about class differences in such an outspoken way, because that was what it was like in Britain in 1940.
And not much has changed.
And actually not much has changed. For example, Jay, who is like lower class, and his house has been bombed, his family either died or was sent to the country. And he says at some point that the way he talks, his accent, will always make clear to everyone what kind of boy he is. And of course nowadays, in many ways that's still the case, especially for example with people, well, in the Netherlands who don't have Dutch as a first language, but who speak another language as first language, and then they speak Dutch with an accent. And that tells people something, and they're being treated differently because of that. And I find it very interesting to be able to write about things like that, not in a direct way, but I'm writing about 1940, but I think I am saying things about modern day society as well.
So in a way that's why youngsters really do like reading your books, I think, because many writers try to teach them throughout the book about how things are supposed to be. You're not supposed to say that, do that, but what you do is you really put that inside the story, like you said, you show different classes and maybe someone starts to think. Is that also something it's like something you do it consciously, or is that something that just happens while writing, to trying to merge the modern world into a book, to tell them that maybe that's not right, think about it, because you're not direct about it?
I think it's a combination, really. I do think about these things before I write them, but at the same time it's just I write about the things I find interesting and the things I think about myself, like inequality and differences between rich and poor, and now with influencers who all they do on social media is show how expensive their bags are and their makeup, and they don't pay for those things themselves. They get those bags to show to their followers and do these advertisements. But all these followers then get sort of insecure. Oh, I should be able to buy a €1,000 bag, and it's crazy, really. So I think about those things myself, and then those thoughts sort of seep into my books.
So we're not going to spoil too much about the book because I'm not allowed to. And I do want to return next year when someone else is going to be sitting here. So you write about 3 different children meeting during World War in a tunnel. And then what's really important to mention about this book is that this is the first book, your book, that someone dies.
Yeah,
Before
and
that,
this
no
is
one
not
dies.
spoiling anything,
Yeah.
because I actually...
As I said, I'm not allowed to.
Yeah, but I mean, I actually tell my readers on the very first page that someone is going to die.
Exactly.
Which is very cruel, I know.
So, it's the first book someone dies. Was it hard to kill a character?
Yeah, it was awful. Yeah,
As far as I know, writers live with their characters, you develop them, and then
yeah. So I wrote the very first page where I'm announcing the death, and then halfway through I thought to myself, if I just delete that very first page, they can all live, and I don't have to kill anyone. So I really did consider that. But I mean, I write about the Second World War. London was bombed for 8 months. Tens of thousands of people did die. And in a way it's so strange that always in books and movies the heroes get to live. Everyone else dies, but the main characters get to live. And with this particular book I thought, no, that's just not right. I will have to kill one of my characters. But I'm not sure I will ever do it again because I hated it.
Was it at least... did you at least kill the character that you didn't like the most?
No, quite the other way round. But then in the end, I mean, in a way, I mean, I have written so many books already that it was, of course, in a way, a very interesting sort of challenge to, well, let's see whether I can pull this off. And many people have told me I made them cry, and usually I'm not happy making people cry, but I'm making someone cry with my book. Yeah, then that means I sort of did succeed. So in the end, it couldn't be any other way, really.
You do leave a happy ending. Maybe just let's calm them down. Just think there is a happy ending.
Yes, I felt I really needed to give my young readers some hope. So, okay, one of the characters dies, but 2 other characters get sort of a fairy tale ending, and I'm very much aware of the fact it's a fairy tale ending, but I just wanted to give that to my readers after the horrible death.
As you mentioned, actually, all 3 characters are from different classes, so they speak in different kind of English language. You know, there's posh British, and the Cockney accent, which is the one no one understands really. Sadly, in a Slovenian translation, that mostly gets lost. But in your own language, did you manage to make the nuances between them with the way you were writing, or not?
If I was able to make the nuances, I'm sure my translator, Katusha, made those nuances as well. But of course, I mean, it's not English. This book, right now, a translator is actually translating it into English.
Against the video.
I thought it's actually getting your books translated into English is sort of the most difficult thing. So English always comes last. No, I actually thought my British publisher wouldn't buy this book because they're quite stuck up about their history, and I thought they wouldn't want to buy a book written by a Dutch author, a story set in London during the war. But I'm very happy they did buy it. But I know the translator will have a very difficult time with those. I mean, she will really have to add something, because of course in Dutch I wasn't able to really properly do the posh British, the middle class British and the lower class British, and she will somehow have to convey that without being, maybe, I mean, it shouldn't be overdone, but I'm very curious to see how she will do that.
Because you managed to show which class they are through your own writing, through describing them. So you still have a lot of dialogue in this book, way more than usual, I would say, yeah. There's a lot of dialogue in this book, and yet you still manage to tell a story through a description. So what I was wondering while I was reading the book is, did you first wrote the book with dialogues and minor descriptions and then reread it and then added some descriptions and make it more connected so that the person does not get lost? Or did you write just in one pace the whole book?
I always rewrite a lot. I rewrite for ages and ages. I think every bit is rewritten at least 100 times. I'm not exaggerating, really 100 times. But I don't know whether, sometimes I do first do a dialogue and then add all the other stuff later on, because I can really hear them talking in my head. And I sort of just write down what I can hear them say. But no, I don't. I think I rewrite everything so many times, both dialogue and descriptions. It's
really amazing, because this dialogue in your book is sometimes you can read it like a play. You know, it just keeps on going, and even though you don't always say Alice said that or someone else said that, it's always just going on. You know exactly who is saying what is going on, and just keeps on going, and then suddenly there's no dialogue, but you still continue describing it. It's really good. It's really well written. So that's what I was wondering, was the dialogue first and then the description, because in other books maybe the dialogue comes after, or the description, or I mean, what's your process when you start a chapter?
I'm not aware of this book being different from other books. No, I mean, I didn't do it on purpose.
So, if you say you didn't do it on purpose, how much time did you write this book? You said you were quite a rereader, a rewriter.
Yeah, well, this book was a horrible book to write. First of all, because it's an historical book and I had to do so much research, and even after doing the big research, on every page I had to Google things. Like, for example, nowadays in London, taxi cabs, they have this window between the driver and the passengers. And did they have that window in 1940 or not? So for ages I Googled photos of old taxis. And I think in the end I just couldn't figure it out. So I thought, yeah, they had the window. But I really tried to research everything. And this was actually the book I wrote during Corona. And I'm a single mum, and my son was 2 when Corona started. And then daycare went into lockdown. So suddenly I was at home with my son 24/7. And the first lockdown was quite amazing, because it was spring and every day we went outside. But in the back of my head, I knew I want to write this book. I had a really good start, and now I can't write. And okay, then daycare opened up again, and then just before the end of the book, there was the December lockdown of the daycare. And my poor, well, he was 3 by then, and he didn't have his afternoon nap anymore, which was awful. For a couple of days I hired a babysitter, and he would sit with the babysitter in his tiny room with this box of Legos, and he just had to be there for like 4 hours, and I was writing like crazy, finishing the last chapters. So I think this book took me like a year and a half to write, which is a very long time for me. But that was because of all the lockdowns.
Since you mentioned that you didn't have so much time, but you still researched very well. You mentioned you went to London as well. So what was your research in London? Like, what did you look for? What were the things you were researching while you were in London?
It was actually 1 month before Corona started, and of course I didn't know, but if I had planned my research trip 1 month later, I wouldn't have been able to go. No, I went to the Imperial War Museum. I went to the London Transport Museum, which is actually a very interesting museum, and they do have lots about the metro, the underground, during the war. And I just walked the streets and traveled by underground a lot, because a lot of those metro stations, they're still the same. They look exactly the same, and I think they still smell the same as they did in 1940.
So the book is now translated into Slovenian language, not just Slovenian, it will get its translation in English. This is a question you're not gonna like. Why do you think that young readers nowadays should read a book about Second World War? I know this is a book where you're talking about the different classes, you're talking about, there's a love story, it's quite a complicated love story. There is a death, there's a fairy tale ending, but still, why should youngsters read a book about Second World War when now we have war in Ukraine, war in Israel, and then going back in time, reading again about war?
Well, it's actually quite heartbreaking. I mean, when I wrote this book, I thought we wouldn't have any wars in Europe anymore. I actually thought I was writing about history. And for almost 2 years, including my research, I had been looking at black and white pictures of people sitting on metro platforms, taking shelter for bombs. And then the book was already published in the Netherlands. And then suddenly in Kiev, in the metro stations, people were once again sitting there on the platforms. And I was, the first time I saw photos of that on the news, the thing that struck me most was those photos were in color, weren't black and white photos, but all these blankets they used on the metro platforms had all these really nice colors and looked so, well, joyful. And it was just heartbreaking, because for 2 years I had been imagining what it must be like to be on a metro platform, on your blanket, taking shelter for bombs. And suddenly it was happening all over again. So actually I don't know whether I would have written this book had the war in Ukraine already been going on. But I wrote it before the war started. And then actually it was very interesting to see when the book was published in the Netherlands before the war in Ukraine, people were treating it like sort of an adventurous love story. And yeah, there's a war going on, but it's an adventurous love story. And then the book was published in both Germany and Italy, a few months after the war in Ukraine had started. And the book was actually taken way more seriously. And all the reviewers were saying it's so important kids read about these things. What's it like to be growing up in a war? And I mean, not many books have already been written about Ukraine, and definitely not about Gaza yet. But still, this can be sort of, in a way, a sort of easy way to get teenagers to think about the wars going on now, because I think it is important to have conversations in classes about what's going on right now, and just have these news articles can be just maybe too painful or not personal enough, and having a story like this, which is also an adventurous love story, it's really, young people actually enjoy reading this book, but at the same time it does make them realize what it's like to be growing up in a war, and I do think it helps them empathize with the kids who are growing up in a war right now.
Exactly, it's a hard topic, but yet it's not that hard to read. I mean, you can
Yeah,
still...
exactly.
So, let's go on a lighter note, away from the war. This is the 28th book, am I correct? What are you planning next? Is there another book coming? What are you preparing? If you have a daycare again.
Well, yeah, no, my son is 6 now, so
Okay,
he's going
so
to
he's in
school,
school,
so I have nice school days to write in. No, I actually wrote sort of a shorter book for 6-year-olds, Skip and the Rabbit Thief, which was sort of an in-between book. But the next, like, proper book will be another, well, sort of for the age group of the tunnel, and it's set back in history once again in the south of France. So sadly, 2 weeks ago my son and I had to go to the south of France for a research trip. So I'm reading a lot about that right now, doing research, and then probably after the summer I'm hopefully going to start and write that book.
Perfect. So it means in a year we'll meet again here. You said this book finishes in a fairy tale ending. So maybe we can finish in a fairy tale ending as well. So my question for you is, and it's a very fairy tale question, what does writing mean to you? Can you imagine not writing?
Well, I can imagine, because sometimes due to circumstances I don't write for like a couple of months maybe. It's either a corona lockdown or, for example, after the tunnel I felt this was, I mean, it was so hard to say goodbye to my characters that it was really difficult to start on a new book. And I think I go crazy without writing. My brain really needs to put I need to put my thoughts into words and make stories. I mean, the world is such a chaos right now, and in my books I'm able to sort of make sense of the chaos, and I really need that.
Do you think it would be easier to write another book if you'd kill more characters?
I'm not sure.
And just for the last question, does your son understand you're a writer? That's something I really want to know.
Yeah, and he never wants to tell me. He's like proud of me, but he understands very well, and of course he's way too young for these books. He's sort of feeling we have this sort of family business. So sometimes he will come with me to something when I do something like this for kids in the Netherlands. Sometimes he will come and just sit there and pretend to be very bored. And then when someone asked a question and asked, yeah, you have written 27 books, he's sitting there, 28 books. So he knows exactly, and he actually thinks it's quite cool.
Perfect. That's a fairy tale ending.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions? If not, then she deserves an applause.